It may surprise many of you to learn that although the ideas of socialism and communism are associated with Marx and Engels, in fact, the ideas of socialism and communism both predate Marx as well as Engels. They are not known as the founders of socialism or as the founders of communism, except colloquially. They are known really as the founders of modern communism or modern socialism. So who are the founders of socialism who predate Marx and Engels? That is the subject of today's lecture. They are now referred to, especially within the Marxist framework, as Utopian Socialists. Now, in order for us to understand where we are at in our story, which has been unfolding since the Reformation, in fact, earlier since the Renaissance, we covered the Renaissance, then we looked at the Reformation, then we looked at the Enlightenment. What we are really trying to capture for you is the emergence of what we refer to in social science literature as the modern world. Or, to put it in Marxist terms, we are looking at the emergence of capitalism from feudalism, the slow process through which capitalism emerges from largely a feudal society. So what we understand about this society and about the old society is that the origins of socialism begin to show already even before capitalism has fully formed itself. In fact, Karl Kautsky, one of the authors I asked you to read, even argues that you can detect a form of communism even in early Christianity, because in the early Christian communities, they did not believe in the creation of private property between themselves. Within themselves, they all ate in common, they all shared in common, and therefore these were kind of primitive communist communities. So when we look at the origin of modern socialism, as opposed to ancient or primitive socialism or communism, because you might already know from history of Western philosophy, if you studied with me, that Plato also had a conception of communism. That's 2,500, 600 years old. His conception of communism was, of course, that the guardian class, the ruling class, would live in a kind of communism where they would have no property and they would also have no families, so that their only task would be to think about philosophical issues and think about how to improve society. Well, this kind of communism, the kind of modern communism that we are going to talk about, its origins, really owes itself to the contradiction, the class antagonism between proprietors on the one hand, that just means people who have property, and non-proprietors on the other hand, people who are without property. And in modern society, the people who are with property generally are known as capitalists in capitalist society. Of course, in older societies, you had people with property who were known, who had other kinds of property, and could be feudal lords or jagirdars or slave owners. After all, slave owners also owned other people. Those other people that were slaves were the property of the slave owners. So women could be a form of property, men could be a form of property, human beings could be a form of property, and of course land could be a form of property as well. But anyway, modern socialism really owes itself to the antagonism between those who own property and those who do not own property in the context of capitalism, in which the property owners become only or mainly capitalists, and those who are without property become wage workers as opposed to other kinds of working classes, such as serfs or such as slaves and so on. The other major feature about the creation of modern socialism is the anarchy of production under capitalism. This is a funny concept, perhaps, to many of you who have studied economics already, because in economics we study all these interesting graphs where you have demand and supply, and then you have competition, and as a consequence of competition, price somehow magically comes and fluctuates, and then kind of comes around the point where you have the best efficient production in terms of the lowest average cost of production and so on. And so we are led to believe that as a consequence of the spontaneous operation of the market, prices will come to a level where they will be optimally placed, such as to spur production. In fact, when we look at the real economy, that is never the case. That is only in theory that that happens. And the reason why it only happens in theory is because in reality, the theory is based on certain premises. And in reality, those premises are not necessarily true. For instance, premises like perfect information, premises like the ability of anyone to enter into a market or the ability of anyone to exit out of a market. Conditions such as the fact that all firms are price takers as opposed to being able to determine the price. So all of these conditions that we associate with perfect competition, of course, are never true. They have never been true in history, and they will never be true in history. So even under those particular conditions, those graphs are merely supposed to be broad approximations of what would happen under ideal capitalist conditions. But those ideal capitalist conditions simply don't exist. Moreover, even if they did exist, we may have a situation where those prices continue to fluctuate so much that you have, in other words, what we call the anarchy of production. What we mean by that is that, and on the whole, the economy is not planned as such. You are undertaking your decisions and you're undertaking production in your plant according to how you think what demand will look like in the next year or in the next 6 months. You are undertaking production at the same time in accordance with how you are perceiving the market. And there's no planning between either of you or between all of you about how much needs to be produced, what needs to be produced, how much demand exists in the economy, and so on. Which is why in the capitalist economy you see business cycles, ups and downs, and even violent fluctuations, not only within one country, not even only within one market and within one national economy, but between economies that can lead entire regions of the world or entire big countries even in the wake of massive economic crises that destroy their economies and sometimes their currencies. This is what Marx and Engels refer to as the anarchy of production. There are other facets of the anarchy of production, such as the fact that production is mainly geared towards the elite, and most people are largely unemployed. Currently in Pakistan, you can see very high levels of inflation. You can see a situation, what we call the debt crisis or the debt trap. You can see other situations where we overproduce certain commodities that are in fact very bad for us, causing environmental crisis. All of these are conditions that describe the anarchy of production. There's no plan as such. Everybody does whatever they want, and the belief, somehow magical belief, is that if everybody does whatever the hell they want, you have complete freedom to produce whatever you want, however much you want, however you want. Somehow or the other it will all come together. Well, newsflash, it rarely ever does, except on the chalkboards of economics professors. And I used to be one of them, so I'm only criticizing myself here. Thirdly, in the theoretical form, as the logical extension of the principles laid down by the great French philosophers of the 18th century. So modern socialism is, in the third instant, the result of the development of ideas of the French materialists who wanted to recreate most of human knowledge on a secular foundation, on a materialist foundation, or in other words, on a scientific foundation. These were not religious doctrines anymore. These are purely doctrines based on rationality. And modern socialism is the product of these three major trends. So the first one is the antagonism between the rich and the poor. The second one is the imperative to control the anarchy of production. And the third one is the development of science, to put it very briefly. But let's just take a step back and look at some of the utopian socialists and see how modern socialism emerges out of the entire situation, which is the destruction of feudalism and the birth of capitalism. So here is Thomas More, who wrote a very important book called Utopia, from which, of course, you get the idea of, quote, utopian socialism. He lived from 1478 to 1535, you can see, and he was a devoted Catholic, even in a time when England itself was going towards a kind of Anglican Protestantism, and the whole of Europe was going towards the Reformation. He was still very much devoted to the Catholic Church, in particular because in England the Catholic Church already had a very, very minor and waning influence, and secondly because the English Reformation he saw as a kind of an effort to really take away from the Catholic churches and from the churches in general their properties, so that the king would have more wealth at his disposal, because taxes were insufficient to bring him the wealth at his disposal, and so that the king would be able to do the things that he wanted to do, including go to war and all those sorts of things. And the taking away of these lands from the church took away from the church a very important social function, which was its role as the major institution for charity of the poor, which of course the church did perform, not only in England, but across all of Europe. So he saw in the English Reformation something that he didn't necessarily, or even more importantly, in the German Reformation, something that he couldn't fully appreciate. Moreover, the German Reformation had the characteristic that it threw up millions and millions of poor peasants into the political struggle, which to Thomas More's mind was something that, that he, and to the humanists in general, they felt that this was not the way for society to move forward. If anything, people like Thomas More and the humanists thought that the revolution or the change should come from the above. The people, the poor people, were too ignorant to really be able to manage a good change. It had to come from the top. In fact, their whole emphasis was, the emphasis of the humanists was that they would be able to write these beautiful things, send it to the prince, send it to the king, send it to whoever was ruling the country, and then that prince would create an enlightened republic. So their writing also, including the writing of this book Utopia was written in Latin, because it wasn't addressed to the general public. It wasn't addressed to the peasants. It was addressed to the elite. They thought they could talk to the elite, and to the elite of the elite, they would talk to, they would talk to Shehbaz, they would talk to somebody, Imran Khan. They would convince Imran Khan or Bilawal that, socialism or communism is the best way to go. And then an enlightened despot would be able to bring that about, because they didn't have that kind of confidence that the people themselves could understand these ideas and create history and society on their own. So they had a somewhat of an elitist view of society and history, and somewhat of a negative view of the public as a whole. When Henry VIII wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, and when the church would not allow it, and one of the main reasons was, of course, that he was already married to Catherine, and that represented an alliance in that time in history. When kings were married to other queens or princesses, etc., it actually represented the cementing of two houses. The royal houses themselves were the ones that controlled the country. So when the English king is married to the Spanish princess, it means England and Spain are in an alliance together. For him to divorce Spanish princess is not just divorcing one person, it's like divorcing Spain as a whole and saying that England will not be allied to Spain any further. So that was something that the Catholic Church was totally against. The Catholic Church said to Henry VIII many times, we'll let you live in bigamy, you can have your affairs, you can do whatever you want, etc. Just don't divorce Catherine, because that means breaking the ties between England and Spain. Don't do that. But he did that nonetheless, because his motives were not just personal, but his motives were also larger and political. Now, Thomas More didn't like that one bit, and he refused it, etc., and he knew that he would be in a lot of trouble, etc., and he was, in fact, executed by Henry VIII for what was deemed to be a rebellion against the king. Although before that, he was one of the key advisors of Henry VIII because of the success of his work, Utopia, which was read widely, and he was considered one of the great intellectuals of that period. So in Utopia, he talks about an ideal society. It's an imaginary state. And in this imaginary state, he says, this is how people will live. There will be no private property. Everybody will be equal. Everybody will wear the same kind of clothes, etc. This is how marriage will take place. And look at what a better society it will be. Everybody will work. There will be no begging, because everybody will be given employment, and so on. He creates an ideal sort of communist utopia. He says, I know all these ideas cannot be implemented, but nonetheless, think about this. What would society be like if we implemented these sorts of ideas? There would be no competition. There would be no rivalry between brothers for riches and property and so on. It would be a much better society. In doing this, he prefigured many of the ideas of modern socialism. He thought of many of the ideas of modern socialism, but as yet they were contained in a framework which was very, very primitive, because the man is, after all, writing in the 16th century. And the 16th century is a horrible century. Not that the 17th was much better. The Reformation is going on. There are killings happening everywhere. Religious fervor is at an all-time high. If somebody thinks that somebody else has said anything negative about the Bible, they catch him and they put him on fire in Swat. No, sorry, that was Pakistan. If somebody thinks that this religious community is going away, they go and they break the worship places of that religious community. Yeah, that's also in Pakistan. In many ways, I think of the 16th century and that particular period as being very similar to what's going on in Pakistan today. If a woman was very, sort of assertive about her rights or whatever, or something else, and she was practicing, maybe she was trying to be a doctor, curing people, they could accuse her of being a witch and have her burnt at the stake and so on. This was all very common in the 16th century. You could even imagine that for some weird reason, the Reformation, which was supposed to reform Europe, had in fact created its opposite, in the sense that everybody had become a religious fanatic. Even the people who were the reformers and the Protestants were themselves religious fanatics, and for literally a century they fought it out with each other, and they persecuted each other, killed each other, and so on and so forth. So it was a period of almost collective madness in a certain broad sense. And if you were living in that period, you wouldn't be able to make sense of it. But now that we zoom out of that period and we can look at it from a historical perspective, we see, in fact, that this was a period in which that old feudal system was breaking down. And when a system is breaking down, that's how it breaks down. When a system breaks down, it's not pretty, it's not nice. It breaks down in a really horrible sort of way. Maybe our own system is breaking down as well, which is why we're seeing so many horrible things. But that would be a logical fallacy, because just because you see horrible things doesn't mean there are better things in the future. You could just stay in horrible things forever. Anyway, leaving aside that skeptical and less optimistic note, so More is one of those people who talks very early on about a communist kind of society, but he calls it utopia. He calls that society utopia, in part because he thought, maybe what I'm talking about cannot be fully achieved. It is a utopia, but it is still a goal worth striving for. Even if we achieve 50% of this, society would be so much better off. One of the great features of utopia, in the midst of all this killing and bloodshed, is the fact that he continuously says that we should not be fighting each other over religion. In fact, that religion should be, in that regard, something of a faith of the individual and a relationship of the individual, etc., with the Almighty. But we should all debate it and discuss it, but we should never get emotional and fight each other over it. So much like Hobbes, Thomas More is one of these seminal figures of this particular period of the Reformation, anarchy, and so on. Another major figure in this period is Thomas Müntzer. He is, as you can see, 16th century, even earlier, 1489 to 1525. He's German, and at first he follows Martin Luther, and he's a Protestant, etc. And he's like, yes, we have to fight against the Catholic Church and so on. But very soon, he becomes much more radical than Martin Luther as well. He becomes way more radical than the Protestant Reformation. In part, he is an apocalyptic preacher. An apocalyptic preacher means somebody who says, the world is coming to an end as we know it. You better fix yourself up. Maybe there'll be a new era, or maybe the whole world will be finished, etc. So you better fix everything, because what you are doing is causing the end of times. Okay? So he's one of those people who believes that the end of times is coming. But he was a representative of the poorest of the poor. He's a preacher. So he's a holy man, okay? He's a church-going guy. He's not some atheist or whatever. But he becomes the representative of the poorest of the poor, of the peasants, the landless, the serfs, etc., and so on. And he argues that the spirit of Christianity, not the letter of Christianity, not what the church says, not even what Luther says, but the spirit of Christianity has always been in defense of the poor. It's for the poor against the oppressors. And there are, of course, lots and lots of sayings of Jesus that you could use for that. For example, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. You could see a class war in that saying of Jesus. And there are many others like this. The meek shall inherit the earth, the wretched shall inherit the earth, the poor shall inherit the earth, etc. Woe to the downpresser, you eat the bread of sorrow, and so on. You can of course also see this in Moses, you can see this in Prophet, peace be upon him, and so on. So he was of the opinion this is the essence of Christianity, and hence what I'm fighting for is really what Christianity really stood for, which is for the downtrodden. And so he said to the peasants, unite, and we're going to fight against these robber barons and these feudal lords and so on. We're going to take back the land, and the land will belong to you, because that is really the essence of what Christianity stands for. Of course, he wasn't much liked, etc. He was the leader of the German peasant war, and he was captured in 1525, brutally tortured, and then of course executed. But considered therefore another very important figure in the Reformation, because this is the most radical side of the Protestant Reformation, a side which not only gets the poor peasants to rise up, but these poor peasants are rising up not only against the church, but more importantly, they're rising up against the Catholic Church, and they're rising up against the local feudal lords within Germany. So these two figures together, both of them are religious figures. They're not atheists, they're not materialists. Both of them are religious figures. One is a Catholic, the other is on the other side of the Reformation, etc. But both are prefiguring, talking about some kind of a future society in which private property will cease to exist, the difference between the rich and the poor will cease to exist, and a new kind of society will be born where there will be equality. And for that reason, these two are considered to be the forerunners of the communist movement that comes about in the time of Marx and Engels. They are therefore referred to as the kind of, you can refer to them as the founders of Utopian Socialism. Okay? Both of them have very different tendencies as well, in the sense that for Thomas More, communism is going to come from the top down. It's going to come from the prince who's going to bring it to the people. And for Thomas Müntzer, it's going to come from the bottom up. And those who were talking about this bottom up sort of communism, they hated the top-down approach. And those who were talking about the top-down approach, they hated the bottom-up approach. They didn't like each other. In fact, both these approaches later get reconciled in the thought of Karl Marx and Engels in modern socialism, but not right now. You'll see that that continues for a while. Now, you see in this period also, in the Enlightenment period, the idea of the kingdom of reason. Religion, natural science, society, political institutions, everything was subjected to the most unsparing criticism in the light of reason. Even reason itself was being subjected to criticism in the light of reason and rationality. So this is a period in which people take real pleasure in saying that we have to counter superstition, injustice, privilege, much like the woke generation that says stop talking from a position of privilege, etc. Oppression, all of these things were to be superseded by eternal truths, eternal right, equality based on nature, and the inalienable rights of man. Of course, so many of these ideas, you can hear these phrases that are so heavy. These phrases are so heavy, so loaded, because these phrases become the central phrases of the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Declaration of Independence and so many other constitutional documents, including the document of Pakistan, etc. So this is the kingdom of reason. So what's the idea? The idea is that humanity has been languishing in ignorance for all this time because we have been too afraid to think for ourselves. We have been so frightened to think for ourselves that we've let other people do our thinking for us. Thinking for yourself is like the main motto of all of education, isn't it? And this is where it really originates. It really originates in the Enlightenment, because they think, okay, in the past, for all these thousands of years of history, people didn't think for themselves. Instead, what they did was, Immanuel Kant says, okay, they let other people do the thinking. Your father will do the thinking for you. He'll decide who you should marry. Puttar, I know better than you who you should marry, etc., etc. Your parents will do the thinking for you and tell you your superiors in the sense that they are part of the church, they are the priests, they are the ulema, they are others, they are scholars, and so on and so forth. They will do the thinking and tell you what is the right way to think even, and you should not do that. So enlightenment में इन लोगों ने ये कहना शुरू किया कि all of this is absolutely wrong and we have to think for ourselves, and if we start to think for ourselves, and what is good thinking? They said good thinking is when you look at things through reason, through rationality, and so on, through evidence, in a scientific manner. When you start doing that and you start thinking yourself, critically thinking about all these things yourself, then all of these superstitions will disappear, all the bad thoughts you have, the wrong things you are doing, all the oppressions will also disappear. All the bad ways in which women are treated, the slavery, the poverty, the injustices of the world, the violence, the war, somehow or the other we will come into a utopia. So the Enlightenment also was strongly utopianist in this way. But the idealized kingdom, but when the French Revolution did occur, none of those things came true. None of those things happened the way they thought it would happen. They thought we would create a society of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And to some extent, yes, that was true. But if you compare the claims of the French Revolution with the reality of France after the French Revolution, there were really two things quite apart. And what did happen was, yes, the feudal lords were overthrown. Their property was taken away. Yes, the church was overthrown. Its property was taken away. But which was the class that gained the most from the French Revolution? It was the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie. Eternal right found its realization only in equality before the law. So the idea was there will be this, everybody will have the same rights, etc. Everybody had the same rights, but only insofar as legal matters were concerned. And even there were many gaplas, like, for example, women were not given the vote till much, much later in the 20th century, etc. But the principle was only before the law. In real social terms and economic terms, you're not going to be equal. Bourgeois property was proclaimed as one of the essential rights of man. So it is my right to have property and to be a capitalist and to exploit workers, etc. Government of reason, the social contract of Rousseau came into being and only could come into being as a democratic bourgeois republic, etc. It didn't become a people's republic. It became a republic in which the bourgeoisie really was in control, not the working class, not the common people, not everybody. And thinkers could not go beyond the limits imposed upon them by their epoch. So looking at the French Revolution there, and looking at the forerunners of the modern proletariat, here is burning of the 16th century, Dutch Anabaptist Anakin Hendricks, charged by the Spanish Inquisition with heresy. Now the Anabaptists also were Christian communists. They also said private property khatam ho. So there's a lot of persecution of the Christian communists. So the antagonism of exploiters and exploited allowed the representatives of the bourgeoisie to put themselves forward as representing not one special class but the whole suffering humanity. In the French Revolution, the capitalist class, the traders said, we don't represent one class, we represent everybody. We are, quote unquote, the people. The concept of the people, which the People's Party used later and many other parties used, basically said, who is not the people? The clergy is not the people and the feudal lords are not the people, but everybody else, even if you're a capitalist, merchant, etc., or you're a worker or a serf, is in one large category called the people. And who is the representative of the people? The merchants and the capitalists. So in this way, the merchants and the capitalists put themselves at the head of, as the leaders of, this category of different classes who were all oppressed, but different classes with different interests, making them into one broad category which they called the people. Okay? Again, it has to be understood that the people, when we also know the people of Pakistan, what do we mean by the people? Do we mean everybody? Well, when the French Revolution was occurring, they didn't mean everybody. They meant the third estate. And who was in charge? Who was leading the third estate? The bourgeoisie. And for a time period, for a brief period, it was possible for the capitalist class to really be the representative of the people, because the working class, the peasants themselves were not organized enough, were not class conscious enough to say, wait a second, these guys are capitalists, we are not capitalists, so we should have our own organization, party or whatever. They were not class conscious enough to realize that the interests of this class is different from our own interests. So there was a time when the bourgeoisie was able to lead the people as such. Saddled with this antithesis, capitalists cannot exist without wage workers though, and in every bourgeois movement there were outbursts of these forerunners. So although the capitalist class tried to bring all the oppressed classes together as the people, but still you saw outbursts of the more oppressed sections of the people strike out on their own and say, no, but our demands are different. Who were they? They were the Anabaptists, then of course Thomas Müntzer I talked about. Also very interesting are the levelers. So the levelers also very interesting, diggers, levelers, etc. They also, they were English, and they also said everybody should be absolutely equal, etc. And Babeuf, who you've studied a little bit in the French Revolution, is also one of these things. Already now you are seeing the theoretical enunciations of a class that is not yet developed. So the working class has not developed as a class. They are not conscious. You look at Pakistan, for example. How many trade unions do you see? Very few. You look at Pakistan, yes, you see a lot of poor people. But do you see poor people coming together and saying, we are poor people, we have to fight for our rights, etc.? You don't see that. Here and there you see it, but you don't see it on a Pakistan-wide level, right? It's the same situation here, which is that the class has not been created, but people have been created who are saying, who are theoretically expressing the opinions of that objectively existing class which does not yet subjectively as such exist, and may also not fully objectively exist, etc. So 16th and 17th century we begin to see utopian pictures of ideal social conditions. We see Thomas More, Müntzer and others. And the 18th century we begin to see actual now communistic theories more developed like Morley and Mabley. Not just political equality, now they are talking about social equality, economic equality, equality in every realm, and of course they are talking now about the abolition of class distinctions. All of this, note, is happening way before Marx and Engels are on the scene. This was a communism which was ascetic. What does that mean? They denounced all the pleasures of life. It was Spartan, and the idea was that if you are a communist, you should not have the AC on. If you are a communist, should not wear nice clothes. You should always wear only wool. For example, Thomas More in his Utopia also writes that everybody in Utopia basically wears wool. And you have to decrease luxury in your life. Now, why was it ascetic? This is a very interesting idea. It is ascetic because as yet the economic mode of production has not moved to large-scale industry. There is no industrial revolution. Everything occurs by hand. Handicraft is the main means through which people are working. And so now if luxury consumption is something that is encouraged, that has to be worked also by hand. And that means that a lot of human labor goes into the production of these luxuries, which was considered by them to be wasted human labor. So the idea was do away with the luxuries, live an ascetic life, so that the burdens on people could be significantly reduced. The laboring burden on the working population could be significantly reduced so that their lives could be improved. So the way to improve the lives of people is to basically say, let's not produce so much. Let's do with less, so that we have to work less, so that we can enjoy life a little more. Now that is no longer true for modern communism, because in modern communism you have with industrial production, suddenly it becomes possible to produce more than anybody can possibly even consume. And so ascetic communism gives way to modern communism later on. Who are the three great utopian socialists just before Marx and Engels? It is Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier and Robert Owen. Let's talk about them one by one because they're very, very interesting. For the utopian socialists, they did not set themselves the task of emancipating only the poor or working class people. For them, the main task was the emancipation of all of humanity. So they are still very much thinking in terms of the Enlightenment spirit, which also, of course, was the idea that all of humanity has to be emancipated. They did not want to emancipate a class, but all of humanity at once. The bourgeois world is irrational and unjust. Okay, so in their view, the problem is not that it is exploitative, that could also be true, but it is exploitative precisely and unjust precisely because it is irrational. It's not scientific enough. So if we start to think more scientifically, we will do away with capitalism. Pure reason and justice have not ruled the world because men have not rightly understood them. So a revolution could have occurred 1,000 years ago. An individual man of genius could have liberated the world at any time in history. All it required for communism to be established or for a new society to be established was somebody smart enough to come along and explain what it was, and then it could be established. They didn't see socialism or communism as the outgrowth and development of the processes of society, but rather they saw it as the outgrowth of the processes of the mind, where if you came up with a great idea, everybody would magically start to follow it. We know now that that is not the case. People come up with great ideas, and yet in their own lifetimes, let's look at the history of science. In their own lifetimes, those really great ideas that later on get proven absolutely correct, in their own lifetimes, those people are outcast. Those people are rejected. Those people are thought of as being crazy, etc. Right? So just because you have a great idea doesn't mean public is going to accept it, doesn't mean people are going to accept it. We had great artists who were recognized 100 years, sometimes 200 years, sometimes 500 years after their death. You have great writers like Machiavelli, who in their own lifetimes get their books banned, etc. But much later it is that people realize their genius and so on. And it was the same with poor Thomas More. It was the same with Müntzer, who were great people. And it was only 300 years later that people said, oh my God, all of this was also there in Thomas More, and we didn't realize, that he had already written all this. I would say it's the same with people like Ibn Khaldun and so many others in our own history, that we only recognize them so much later. Or for example, for that matter, the person who's unified strong and weak nuclear force. I don't even know what strong and weak nuclear force is, etc. And so I can't appreciate what a great thing it was that Dr. Abdul Salam accomplished, because I don't have the knowledge to be able to really understand what it is that he did anyway, or what his significance is. So maybe it'll take another 100 years before Pakistanis wake up and say, you know what, he did something fantastic, etc. But right now that's not the case. Right? So the other major factor here is, amongst the utopian socialists, is that they are disappointed with the French Revolution. Rousseau's social contract now becomes the reign of terror. The directorate which comes into power is very, very corrupt, etc. And finally, you have Napoleon that takes over the whole French Revolution, and that is considered by the more democratic-minded people as being, the degeneration of the French Revolution. Not only that, after that, of course, there's a Bourbon restoration, the monarchy comes back, then there's a second revolution, I told you, then there's a third revolution, and so on. So there's a lot of disappointment with the French Revolution. People thought it would be much easier to make the revolution and create this new society, but it wasn't as easy as they thought. It took a long, protracted process. And even then, when the new society was created, it didn't fulfill all the things that they wanted it to fulfill. So there was the idea of eternal peace came to an endless war of conquest. The idea was French Revolution would create peace. But what happened is that Napoleon then went out and said, okay, I'm going to conquer the world. He went to Egypt, and he went to Syria, and he went to North Africa, and then he conquered the Austro-Hungarians, and then he went to Russia, where he was defeated and had to come back, and blah, blah, blah. Just turned into an endless bloody war of conquest. And the antagonism between the rich and the poor intensified. Industry brought mass poverty. The freedom of property became the freedom from property, etc. So the conditions were pretty bad. In fact, the peasants who were the most gung-ho about the French Revolution, who fought the French Revolution the hardest, they were the ones who suffered the most. It's the irony of history. They were the ones, in fact, who suffered the most after the French Revolution. They became poor and so on. Of course, after a long time, their conditions did improve. But in the immediate aftermath, things were not necessarily much better. Trade became cheating, cash payments became the sole nexus between man and man, force was replaced by corruption, the sword by gold, and so on. And this era, this kingdom of reason that was supposed to be so amazing, didn't turn out to be so amazing. It turned out to be like this, etc. The right of the first night was transferred to the bourgeois manufacturers. Prostitution increased. Marriage remained the legally recognized form of prostitution, supplemented by adultery. None of the problems that the French Revolution was supposed to solve, it didn't seem to solve any of them, right? Or at least it appeared like that. It appeared like that. So now the utopian socialists were the first. These are the people who you could say these are the ones that were the most gung-ho pro-French Revolution. And when they saw these disappointments, it's not that they became anti-revolution and they joined the monarchy, whatever, but instead they expressed these disappointments and began to look for the reasons. Why did the French Revolution fail to create the kind of society that we wanted to see? And in 1802, Saint Simon wrote the Geneva Letters. In 1808, Charles Fourier's first work came out. Robert Owen wrote in 1800. He undertook the reconstruction of New Lanark, which is this mill. I'll talk about it in just a bit. So, what about the early proletarians in this point in time, the working class? The conflict arising from capitalism were only just beginning to take shape. So, industry is just beginning to take shape. Let me explain to you. This is a period of time in which industry is powered by water. There's no electricity. After the water wheel comes the steam engine. अभी भी भाप से चला रहे हैं वो मशीनें. Then much later comes electricity. So when we talk about industry and we talk about the proletariat, we're talking about a time in history which is still really, really ancient. Okay? So the conflicts arising from capitalism were only just beginning to take shape. The proletariat evolved from the have-nothing masses, incapable of independent political action. They were an oppressed, suffering order to whom help could at best be brought from above. So right now the proletariat is not organized as a class that is ready to fight for itself. They are kind of helpless. And in these crude conditions, crude theories were created. This is Thomas More's idea of the perfect communist society. This is a picture of Utopia over here. Society presenting nothing but wrongs. To remove them was the task of reason. Attempts to discover a new perfect system and impose this by propaganda and by example of modern experiments. This is what the Utopian Socialists aspired towards. Okay? And hence, these kind of works came into being. Saint Simon, 1760 to 1825, a child of the French Revolution, and I would also say of the Industrial Revolution. He's one of the first people who really thinks of the French Revolution as a class war between nobility, bourgeoisie, and the non-possessors. But he is the first one to really depict it in that way and to clarify our minds. Therefore, it's not just the French Revolution that can be a class struggle. Politics is the science of production. Oh my God, that's amazing. What does that mean? It means that because the economic system generates classes, and classes conflict with each other, and when they conflict with each other, that is what creates politics. So really, it is the economic system that leads to politics. Or in other words, politics is nothing but concentrated economics. He gave the idea of the abolition of the state by stating that politics should be absorbed by economics. So this is an idea again that's taken up by modern communism, which is that the state will be abolished and that we will have an administrative structure that will just manage the economy and run it, but when classes come to an end. And he argued for the alliance of France and England and Germany for peace in Europe in 1815, which was something which was quite difficult to do at that time. He pointed out that the bourgeoisie had grown rich through speculation in the lands of the nobility and the church, and partly by frauds upon the nation by means of army contracts. So everything that had gone wrong with the French Revolution, he spoke about that. And he divided society into two different kinds of classes. His class analysis was a bit simplistic. The idlers were old privileged classes and all who lived on their incomes without taking any part in production. And the workers were wage workers, but also capitalists, merchants, and bankers. Because capitalists, merchants, and bankers still did some work. A merchant would obviously go to the docks and maybe travel with the ship and so on and so forth, take care of his cargo. A banker would go to work, etc., look at how much money has come in, how much money has gone out, etc. He didn't think of merchants, bankers, and manufacturers as exploiting, as part of the exploiting class. So who was in the exploiting class? The nobility and the clergy. So his class analysis was very similar to the French Revolution wala class analysis. Now who would lead this utopia? Science and industry united by mystic and rigidly hierarchical new Christianity. So he's not an atheist in that sense. He wanted to create a new Christianity, reformed Christianity, a religion of humanity, a religion of universal love that would unite people, and that would be the new religion in which science and industry would also thrive. Scholars, working bourgeois, capitalists who did actual work, manufacturers, merchants, bankers would become public officials they would be the social trustees that would manage the economy and run the economy. Okay? Bankers would direct the whole of social production by regulation of credit, and all men will essentially work. Now obviously you can see this is very different from Marxian socialism, because Marx doesn't consider the bankers to be, Marx considers the bankers to be wankers. Right? He doesn't like the bankers at all. He doesn't like the capitalists either. But in this socialism, capitalists, bankers, manufacturers, merchants are all part of workers, etc., and the good guys. Second, we have Francois-Marie Charles Fourier, one of the greatest satirists of all time. Who was this guy? This is the Habib Jalib of the French. Why? He compares the dazzling promises of the kingdom of reason, that is of the French Revolution, of a civilization in which happiness should be universal, of an illimitable human perfectibility, and the rose-colored phraseology of the bourgeois ideologists of his time with social reality. And he points out how everywhere the most pitiful reality corresponds with the most high-sounding phrases. And he overwhelms this hopeless fiasco of phrases with his mordant sarcasm. He depicts with equal power and charm the swindling speculations that blossomed out upon the downfall of the revolution and the shopkeeping spirit prevalent in and characteristic of French commerce at the time. And he is one of the people who says, in any given society, the degree of women's emancipation is the natural measure of the general emancipation of people and society. Great feminist, in fact, great feminist. And you know this phrase by Charles Fourier has been taken by so many different leftists. In fact, in Pakistan, it is often associated with Bacha Khan. Bacha Khan writes it in his own book as well. No doubt taking it from the left literature, etc., who in turn take it basically from Fourier. His conception of history also is very interesting because he divides history into these stages: savagery, barbarism, patriarchate, and civilization. By the way, savagery and barbarism today have a very negative context, tinge to them. But in his time, it doesn't necessarily mean savagery is necessarily negative. But yes, it is a more primitive stage of civilization. The civilized stage raises. Now listen to this. This is amazing. Because we always think of history moving forward. We are going from being ignorant to becoming more and more enlightened. But he reverses the whole dialectic. What does he say? The civilized stage raises every vice practiced by barbarism in a simple fashion into a form of existence, complex, ambiguous, equivocal, and hypocritical. It takes every bad thing that was done by the primitive people and it makes it worse on a grand scale. That's what civilization really is. And bourgeois civilization, it moves in a vicious circle. Vicious. Why is it vicious? In contradictions which it constantly reproduces without being able to solve them. Hence, it constantly arrives at the very opposite to that which it wants to attain or pretends to want to attain. Of that, under civilization, poverty is born of superabundance itself. Today, poverty can be eliminated with a fraction of the global wealth that is created. And yet it continues to exist. And if all these organizations talking about eliminating poverty, or take another example, you have the West talking about liberalism, individual rights. We even want to give rights to anybody who wants to wear different shoes or whatever the case is, etc., sexuality, gender, everything. And what about the rights of the Palestinians? What about the rights of people of the third world? Do they have any rights at all? Are they going to be safe from being bombarded by a scientifically, military superpower in the region? Silence. Complete silence. So that is really described by Fourier right here, the contradictions of modernity, what it aspires to, everybody's equal and everybody's free and so on. And the reality, nobody's equal and nobody's free. Only a few, only the elite in every society and in the globe as a whole. That is the reality. So Fourier's dialectics, he argues against talk about the illimitable human perfectibility, that every historical phrase has its period of ascent and also its period of descent. Fourier introduces into historical science the idea of the ultimate destruction even of the human race itself. Maybe humanity itself will come to an end, the world will come to an end, etc., and so on. Next, let's talk about the Industrial Revolution. Steam and tool-making machinery were transforming manufacture into modern industry. Now we think of steam, and I have spoken about steam as being very, very primitive. But in this period of history, in the 19th century, steam revolutionized the economy. Everywhere where steam production came about, boom, suddenly you had a power which was considered to be so amazing that it could produce so much more than anybody could ever imagine. It was considered to be the nuclear power of its age. जिस तरह आज हम सोचते हैं ना कि oh my God, I am Loki and I will have that tesseract which will be able to power entire worlds, etc. That's how people imagined steam power to be at that time. It was the tesseract of that period. In the Industrial Revolution, ये देखो बच्चे चढ़े हुए हैं. This is England, okay? This is the Industrial Revolution, people living in England at that time. Child labor, etc., all of that. So the speed of development became a storm, although when I look at it today, it doesn't look like much of a storm to me. It looks like a storm in a teacup, because the growth rate of the Industrial Revolution at that time was 1%. Yes, the economy was growing at 1%. 1% in that era of history was considered a storm. Today, if your country president stands up and says, I made the economy grow at 1%, तो छितर पड़ेंगे उसको ठा करके. Because why? Because previously in history, society had never grown even by 1%. Things used to be, 1% growth used to be hit in centuries, not in years. So the speed of development had become a storm. Society was being torn into workers and capitalists, etc. Poverty was being created, a new kind of poverty, homelessness, loosening of all traditional moral bonds of patriarchal subordination. Families were being broken up, destruction of family relations, frightful overwork, especially of women and children, and the complete demoralization of the working class. What do we mean by demoralization here? उनकी morality टूट रही थी. In the sense, crime भी पैदा हो रही थी, drunkenness पैदा हो रही थी, alcoholism, drug use, prostitution, sex work. They could not maintain any of the ideas of morality, whatever they had, because their conditions of life had sunk so low into poverty, etc. It was only later that the proletariat recreated itself when it became a class for itself. You see? So it was a horrible period. And in this period stepped forward this guy named Robert Marcus Owen, 1771 to 1858. Now at the time coming forward, he was a reformer, and he was 29 years old, not much older than you guys. He used to study at Lums. Oh, no, that's not it. He didn't study at Lums, but he was from the elite. He was a rich man. His daddy was rich. His family was rich. In fact, they had a mill. So he was a capitalist, not a worker. He was a man of almost sublime, childlike simplicity of character, and at the same time, one of the few born leaders of men. Simple man, loving person, but with great determination. He gave the idea, started writing, that man's character is the product of hereditary environment of the individual during his lifetime, and especially his childhood. In other words, character is not about religion. Ethics and morals is not about spoon feeding it to somebody. What is it about? It's about creating the right conditions. You create the right conditions, especially in childhood. It's not so much important what you keep saying. It's more important what conditions you give the child. You create the right conditions and you'll see that that person will be of a different character. Change the environment, in other words, and you can change man's nature. And since he was a rich man and in charge of this mill, yes, this is his mill. It still exists. This is in Lanark. He ran a factory with 2,500 workers. When he joined the factory as the manager, he discovered that the workers were demoralized. What does he mean? There was drunkenness. People would drink all the time. There was prostitution, child labor, all kinds of horrible things. And he said, you know what? We have given them inhuman conditions to live in, and that's why all of this is happening. So he changed the life of working class people. He started giving them good pay. So he placed the people in conditions worthy of human beings. And he started raising a generation of new young people. In fact, he created infant schools where the working class people, unke jo bache, they would go to school. And they would love that school so much. This is infant school. So like infants, like 1-year-old, 2-year-olds, etc. going to school. They loved those schools so much they didn't want to come home. This is a statue of Robert Owen, which is in London, as you can see, in front of the Cooperative Society. He is greatly admired in London till this particular day. And he thought that from his profits, he is going to create welfare. And you know what happened? He started working people less. 4 mahine kaam khatam tha. He still continued paying his workers wages. Even though for 4 months they could not work because there was a cotton crisis. And in all this time, did his profits go down? No, in fact, they doubled. They increased because the workers were so happy. They're like, we're going to come, we're going to work diligently. This is the best job we've ever had. He treats us well. He doesn't shout at us, doesn't scream at us, doesn't do horrible things to us. We are looked after. Our children are looked after. This is our home. We're going to work hard. They worked harder. But Owen was still not happy. He said, nahi, nahi, baat nahi bani. The people are still just slaves at my mercy. मैंने अच्छा कर दिया तो अच्छा जिंदगी गुजार ली. I wanted more. He said that the working people now, 2,500 persons, was daily producing as much real wealth for society as less than half a century before it would have required the working part of 6 lakh people to create. I asked myself, what became of the difference between the wealth consumed by 2,500 persons and that which would have been consumed by 600,000 people? 2,500 people with industrial technology are able to produce what used to be produced by 600,000 people. Where is the extra wealth going? What's happening to that? If this new wealth had not been created by machinery imperfectly as it has been applied, the wars of Europe in opposition to Napoleon and to support the aristocratic principles of society could not have been maintained. And yet this new power was the creation of the working classes. This new power, productive capacity, is created by workers. I control it. It supports all the aristocracies of Europe, but it's to the workers that this new power belongs. He went communist. Till before he was just a philanthropist. Now he's gone communist. He says this should belong to the working class. Industrial machinery was being used to enrich the bourgeoisie and to enslave the masses. What do I want? Industrial machinery must be used as common property, work for the common good of all. Industrial machinery will build a new society. So now he wants to build communism, but unlike all the ones before him, he's going to build it on industrial machinery. So he went communist. Communism has to be not utopian now, he says, but practical. So he's run a mill. He knows how these things are calculated. He's like, I can do this. Not only did he provide incredible famine relief in 1823 in Ireland through creating communist colonies. In fact, he tried to create communist colonies in the United States of America as well to show that communism could in fact work. This was a turning point in his life. As long as he was merely a nice capitalist who rewarded his workers well, he was loved. He had wealth, he had applause, he had glory, he was the most popular man in Europe. Not only men of his own class, but statesmen, princes listened to him approvingly. They would call him over, they would say, come Mr. Owen, teach us about Lanak, how did you accomplish this miracle, etc. But when he came out with his communist theories, oh my God, he was outcast from society. He said 3 great obstacles block the path of social progress. The first is private property, the second is religion, and the third is the present form of marriage. You can imagine he became so radical, he became an outcast. Owen was now excommunicated. The most popular man in Europe, excommunicated. He knew he would be outlawed, he would be outcast, excommunicated, his social position would be attacked, his, everything would be attacked, and yet without fear he knew what would happen. He wasn't scared. He was banished from official society. There was a conspiracy of silence against him in the press. He was ruined by his unsuccessful communist experiments in America, and he sacrificed all his money and fortune for his ideas. And then he still did not give up, even after becoming poor. He turned directly to the working class. He joined the working class, and he continued to work amongst workers for 30 years. He lived amongst them, he worked for them, and so on. Every social movement in Britain salutes Robert Owen and says, this was a man who gave up everything for the poor and downtrodden. After 5 years of fighting in 1819, he pushed through the first women's legislation, child labor legislation. He said he was president of the trade unions Congress. When all the trade unions of England came together, who did they elect as president? They said, Robert Owen sada sadar hoega. He is the one who sacrificed the most for us. He introduced cooperative societies for retail trade and production, which still, by the way, exist 200 years later. He introduced labor bazaars for the exchange of the products of labor through the medium of labor notes. Yani he created his own currency, a labor currency whose unit was a single hour of work. The old communism, was Engels writes, was like rounded pebbles in a brook. Pebbles in a brook become round. Okay? What does he mean? Utopian socialism is the extension of absolute truth, reason, and justice, and is only to be discovered to conquer all the world by virtue of its own power. The Utopian socialists were all, in one regard, quite similar. in this regard, that they thought it is independent of time, space, and of the historical development of man. It is a mere accident when and where it is discovered. Socialism is not born as a consequence of the contradictions of society and history, but it is just born out of just reflecting on his history, and then everybody comes to that conclusion. Every socialist came up with their own version of the absolute truth, depending on their conditions, knowledge, and intellectual training. All these absolute truths were mutually exclusive. So the whole game was to confine this absolute truth. Marx and Engels are not looking for an absolute truth in that sense. They're looking for a scientific truth. But scientific truth has a quality of always developing further, always moving forward. An absolute truth does not have that quality. An absolute truth, the quality of the absolute truth is it's going to be true for all time. Marx and Engels don't think that. But the earlier utopian socialists did think that way. This led to an eclectic, mishmash, average socialism, allowing of the most manifold shades of opinion, critical statements, economic theories, pictures of future society that create minimum opposition. So it was a mishmash of lots of confused ideas. A mishmash created as a result of the definite sharp edges of individual constituents are rubbed down in the stream of debate like rounded pebbles in a brook. So they were all debating with each other, and they all kind of said, okay, let's agree, so let's agree to disagree, so let's just, kind of mishmash it all together and create something. Wasn't very scientific, even though they all thought that rationality would lead to this new sort of idea. Some questions to consider. Why do we consider the earliest socialist utopians? Because they did not see socialism as the result of the contradictions in society, but rather they saw it as a utopian goal that would come out of reason. What did the leaders of the French Revolution hope to achieve, and what went wrong? Liberty, equality, fraternity. It didn't happen that way. The bourgeoisie came to power, and when the bourgeoisie came to power, the kind of society that was created was quite far from the promises made. Were Owen's efforts doomed to failure? If so, why? Yes, probably in his own period, because the ruling class was so opposed to them, and these were little experiments in little isolated places. Because the class of proletarians had not come together as a class for itself to fight for its rights, which if it did and created a society where the class itself would be hegemonic, that would be a different story altogether. But here, an isolated communist experiment in an otherwise capitalist society could survive to some extent, but could not transform society as a whole outside of the class as a whole being organized. Engels, though, heaps praises on all these three people, Saint-Simon, Fourier, Owen, gives them credit for many, many different things. To Saint-Simon, he says, look, he gave us the idea of class struggle. He gave us the idea that politics is class struggle. He gave us the idea that politics is concentrated economics. He gave us the idea that a future state will mainly look at how to economically run society, organize society. He gave us the idea, so that's the idea of the abolition of the political state. To Fourier, he gave us ideas about how modernity keeps going in these cycles. Civilization is not as great as people make it out to be. He gave us the ideas about women's emancipation. He criticized the French Revolution, showed us where it went wrong, etc., on the basis of which we could go further. And for Robert Owen, he gave us the idea that we are all the products of our environment. We are all the products of the kind of society we are born in, the families we are born in, the schools we go to, the social circumstances we're born in. If you change those social circumstances, human nature itself changes. Human nature is not something that is just fixed for all time. Our natures are created by our circumstances. Change those circumstances, humans change. And he proved it. How did he prove it? He gave workers, poor people, a good life. And when he gave them a good life, all the horrible things, he saw alcoholism, khatam ho gaya, crime, khatam ho gayi, sex work, prostitution, khatam ho gaya. People were happy. They were working hard. They led good lives. Give them good circumstances. Their whole behavior begins to change. And what is true for one small mill is also true for society as a whole. Pakistanis are neither good nor bad. Give them the right conditions, they will thrive. Give them these kind of conditions, and you see what results will be created from the kind of conditions you have.